From Capitol News, Illinois, it's Friday, January 17th, the start of the Martin Luther King Jr. Day weekend. I'm Peter Hancock, and this is Capitol Cast. This weekend, Americans will remember and celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, the leader of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. King was the driving force behind some of the most important and memorable events of that time, events that are seared into our memory through newsreel footage and other accounts, such as the Montgomery bus boycott of the 1950s and the March on Washington in 1963 that led to the unforgettable I Have a Dream speech that was delivered on the National Mall. But before the days of video cameras and newsreel footage, there was another civil rights movement with leaders of its own, many of whom have gone largely forgotten. So I thought today would be a good time to remember some of the leaders of that civil rights movement that took place here in Illinois a century earlier in the 1860s and 1870s, and a largely forgotten leader of that movement, John J. Bird. My guest today is Wayne Pitard. He is the author of a new book about John Bird entitled Watchman, Tell Us, John J. Bird and Black Politics in Post-Civil War Illinois. It was published just last year from Southern Illinois University Press, and in November, the book was honored with the Friends of Morris Library Delta Award at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. Pitard is an emeritus professor of religion and director emeritus of the Spurlock Museum of World Cultures at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He's with us here today to talk about the legacy of John Bird. Professor Pitard, thanks for being here.
Well, I appreciate your inviting me. Thank you.
Yeah. So your book focuses on John J. Bird and sort of this first generation of post-Civil War, post-slavery civil rights leaders. And I would like you to first take us back in time to Illinois and especially Southern Illinois in Cairo in the final days, final months of the Civil War. What was going on down in the southern tip of Illinois where you can literally stand on the riverbank and look across the river and see what was then enemy territory?
So, Cairo was a rather extraordinary city. It began in the early 1800s as an attempt to set up a depot area for ships that were traveling up and down the Mississippi and Ohio. It was not a very successful city and did not become a real city until the late 1850s. By 1860, it had a population of 2,000 people. It was almost all white, as most cities were actually in Illinois. It had only 47 African American citizens out of the 2,000. But things changed dramatically with the arrival of the Civil War because Cairo is sitting on the place where the Mississippi and the Ohio River merge. And that is a critical point. When the Civil War broke out, the Union very quickly took control of the Cairo region, and the small town became the Union forces' primary southern depot for the Western campaign. And by 1864, its population had quadrupled to about 8,500 people, of which 2,000 or so were African American refugees from the war-torn South. Mostly women, children, and older people. And so they were about 25% of the population, but they were in deep need of food, shelter, and clothing. They were free in some sense, but they were without any clear legal status. And the Democratic city leaders, the Democratic Party being the party of the Old South, the pro-slavery party of the Old South, which was very popular in southern Illinois. The Democratic city leaders wanted nothing to do with these refugees.
So Cairo was also home to what was called Fort Defiance, and its
That's correct.
commanding general was General Ulysses S. Grant. And as I understand from your book, the Union Army would run raids in the southern states as part of an effort to free up the Mississippi River for Union forces, and they would bring back freed slaves that were taken from plantations in the South and sort of drop them off in Cairo, uh, in what was ostensibly free territory here in Illinois, an influx of population that wasn't necessarily welcomed by the white establishment of Cairo.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah. Illinois itself was very um, uh, anti-black. It had black laws that said a black person could only spend 10 days in Illinois without paying a huge bond that almost no blacks could afford to do. And if they stayed more than 10 days without having posted this bond, they were eligible for arrest and actually essentially sail for temporary slavery in the state within the state. So it was not a good place for black people anyway. And all of a sudden, there's this huge influx in southern Illinois in the Cairo area. At least about 5,000 refugees came to Cairo, and some were actually shipped back into to a Union-controlled island in the Mississippi. But large numbers refused to go back anywhere in the South, and they became the basis of the population of Cairo. They actually became the second largest black community in Illinois after Chicago.
Okay, so it's against this backdrop that the lead character in our story here, John J. Bird, comes to Illinois. Who is this guy? Where did he come from? What sort of background did he have?
So, John Bird was born in 1844 in Cincinnati, Ohio, to free black parents. His father was a steamboat steward, but he died when John was 9. His mother, Catherine, married about a year later a prominent minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church by the name of Augustus R. Green. He was also a very much an activist in African American civil rights. He was a conductor for the Underground Railroad in Cincinnati, which is one of the most important routes up from the slave states toward Canada. He was a newspaper editor. He was a very strong proponent of education, and he was very much an advocate for civil rights. So John was educated by his parents, who gave him a very strong love for intellectual pursuits, history, politics, and current affairs. They also trained him to be an excellent orator and an advocate, very much an advocate for civil rights.
And so, how did he come to Southern Illinois?
So, at the age of 20, um, he decided that he needed to do something to help the community in Cairo. And so in the summer he of 1864, he went down to Cairo for an extended visit, and found the place to be in pretty poor shape. Like I said, the Democratic Party controlled the city of Cairo and were very much opposed to supporting the black community there. He came. He was young. Was clearly charismatic and well educated, and so he came to actually work on behalf of this distressed population, advocating for their rights, working to establish schools, including eventually a tuition-free school, 1867, trying to help on medical care and adequate housing. Um, but it was complicated because of uh, uh, the fact that the whole apparatus of Cairo was controlled by people who viewed the black community as enemies.
And so I'm guessing at this time, most of the black population in southern Illinois and in Cairo were freed slaves. These are people who had never had the benefits of education, had never uh, never had any sort of familiarity with being free citizens. This was all sort of new to them. So I guess in some ways, maybe there wasn't a whole lot to work with there. Um, what sort of challenges did they face? Uh, John Bird and the other civil rights leaders at that time, and what were they trying to accomplish in those very early stages?
So the big thing was education. He came down. The first thing we know about John Bird at Cairo was the fact that he gave a talk at a celebration of the contraband camp school there. The refugees were generally referred to as contrabands in the Civil War period. And this was a government school that had been built for the refugees. And the first thing we hear about John Bird there is that he is giving a talk at the school itself. He became involved with several other people who, in the early post Civil War, uh, set up schools, mostly ministers, at the various black and some white churches. And these schools mostly uh, had no other source of income than the parents, and so they did have to charge a small tuition to cover the costs of the teacher and such. Um, um, the minister at the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Cairo, and John Bird and John Gladney, uh, another prominent leader there, joined forces to try to set up a tuition free private school in 1867, which lasted for a while. But the big push came for trying to get legislation that would require the state to provide public education for young black kids.
And how difficult of a task was that? I mean, Illinois had laws like many states, including many northern states, providing for free public education of white students,
That's correct.
not necessarily of African American children. So, how heavy of a lift was it to try and get the state to even consider public education for people of African descent?
Yeah, it took until 1872 for the um, legislature to amend the text of the school law to drop the word white. But it took until 1874 for them to explicitly say that black kids were children under the terms of the act. And so it was a slow process. But the unusual situation about Cairo was that so with their population in the uh, 1860s, late 1860s, early 1870s, there were about 600 voting Democrats in the city, and there were about 200 voting Republicans. But in 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution came into effect, which gave African American men the right to vote. And because of their population in Cairo, they had about 400 men eligible to vote. And so Byrd became the organizational leader of the Black Republican wing to organize as many of those 400 men who were eligible to vote for the Republican Party, which was at that time the party of Lincoln, the party of Reconstruction. So they were the party that really supported Black rights. And so when the Black community was eligible to vote, suddenly, with their 400 men and the 200 voting white Republicans, they suddenly had 600 votes as well. So all of a sudden, the Republican Party was at near parity with the Democrats of Cairo. And this made a huge difference. Suddenly, uh, the Republican Party could, in fact, win elections. And with the majority of the Republicans being African Americans, their interests were part of the interests of the Republican Party of the city. So it brought about expanded civil rights for the Black community that was really quite exceptional in Illinois and actually in most of the North, leading to the appearance of a black public school in 1871. So that's a year before the legislature actually passed the uh, law that allowed for the setting up of public schools for black children. It was a segregated school, but it was a black public school. And because of the political clout of the Republican Party, led by Byrd, um, this black public school was essentially equal in quality to the white schools, which was also not the case in most parts of Illinois and in most states in the North.
And so much of his work then was focused, as you say, on achieving educational rights for
That's
black students. They also pushed for voting rights. They pushed for other kinds of legal rights,
yes,
the rights to testify in court, the rights to serve on juries, the rights to swear out complaints against somebody else. And they achieved some significant success, did they not?
they did. Cairo became this extraordinary place by 1873, as we'll talk about. Numerous African Americans were elected to office in city and county governments roundabout. The cities gave jobs and business contracts to African American firms. The public buildings, all the buildings connected to the city, and most private buildings, public buildings were integrated in Cairo, and many of the businesses were integrated as well. So it was really quite a remarkable thing. And Byrd was the person leading the community in organizing to get these things done.
And one of the things I found fascinating about this story is that when you think of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, you think of the role of African American churches. Not
Yep.
so much In the 1860s, 1870s, why were the churches not as big a player at that time as they were 100 years later?
Yeah, this was one of the surprising things that I found in working through the material. Um, the church in Cairo did not begin until 1863, when eight people got together and formed the first African Methodist Episcopal Church there, because there was no real African American community before the Civil War, and so there was no foundational infrastructure for the Black community that suddenly arrived in massive numbers in 1862, 1863, and 1864. And so what happened was that ministers came to found churches in the post-Civil War period, and it just seemed like the wrong ministers arrived for particularly the Missionary Baptist Church. They had two congregations, and the ministers of both of those seemed to be more involved with attacking one another and attacking the African Methodist Episcopal congregation, and they were just constantly in battle with one another. So one of the great things that Byrd and his colleagues, William Scott and John Gladney, did is they instead formed a secular civil rights organization, which was the Black Republican Club. And they set it aside from all of the arguments that were going on between the churches and such, and they focused it on voting rights and education and job opportunity and important issues like that. And they made it non-sectarian and non-religious, and it then flourished and became the central civil rights organization in Cairo in that period.
And then you write in the introduction of the book, it was maybe kind of the peak of his career or the peak of his fame. In 1874, Byrd is invited to speak at the dedication of this new Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, and he goes there to speak. He is, by that time, I think, the first and only black person to serve on the University of Illinois Board of Trustees. Is that correct?
Yes, he was the first, and he was the only black member of the Board of Trustees until 1958, when the next black member was appointed. But he was appointed in 1873 to the University of Illinois Board of Trustees, an all-white university with an all-white Board of Trustees. I do not know of any other uh, essentially white university who appointed a black board of trustees member any time before the 1880s. So he is unique. He is certainly the first to be appointed to a white university in Illinois, but I think it's the case all across the North. A month after he was appointed to the university, he ran for the office of police magistrate, a judgeship in Cairo, um, and and won. There were three white candidates for it. They kind of split the white vote, but with the black vote and some of the Republican white vote, he won that. There was a huge outcry among whites who were horrified that a black man might be able to uh, pass judgment on a white prisoner and such. And there was quite a bit of turmoil for a while, but once things got resolved, he gained a reputation for fairness that was such that 4 years later, when he ran for re-election as the magistrate, he and the Democrats put against him a single white candidate to try to beat him. He still won. He won with a large segment of white votes as well as the black votes, and that indicates the his reputation for integrity and fairness.
And so it's not long after that. There's the election of 1876, the election of Rutherford B. Hayes as President of the United States. Reconstruction comes to a crashing halt throughout the United States. How significant of an event was that for Illinois and for the civil rights movement that was going at that time?
It is a huge thing. It is a disaster for African Americans in the South, where they essentially lost all hope of gaining their due constitutional rights, and so that was in itself a massive disaster in the South. In the North, it was not as big a uh, uh, trauma because uh, Reconstruction, the major part of Reconstruction had been done in the South, and the improvements in the North had been substantial as well, and they did not go away in the 1870s. They didn't. They declined a bit in the 1880s. It was the 1890s that brought about the real collapse of of African American rights in the entire nation. That is symbolized by the 1896 Supreme Court decision that uh, announced that the separate but equal doctrine was constitutional, and that therefore segregation in public conveyances, segregation in schools, segregation in any kind of public building was constitutional, and that brought a final conclusion to the first civil rights movement.
Okay, Wayne Pitard. The book is Watchman Tell Us John J. Bird and Black Politics in Post Civil War Illinois from Southern Illinois University Press. You can Google it, you can find it on Amazon. It's a fascinating book. I wish we had more time to talk about it. But Professor Pitard, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
And that'll do it for this edition of Capital Cast. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation, with significant funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Until next time, this is Peter Hancock on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team saying thank you for listening.